Well, this is going to be a slightly unusual video. Today I had the unexpected opportunity to go and listen to Justin Amash speak. Justin Amash, for those of you who don't know, is by far the closest congressman to Ron Paul. In fact, I don't think there's any reason to judge him to be less of a libertarian than is Dr. Ron Paul. He was explicitly endorsed by him when he was elected. Ron Paul pointed him out as the most significant new congressperson when he was elected in 2010. He is, as far as I can tell, and of course the motivations and thinking of other people is always qualified as being uncertain from our perspective. He seems to be extremely principled and motivated from, at the very least, a strong minarchist position. His wall in his office is decorated with portraits of Menger, Mises, Hayek, Bastiat, and Rothbard. And they're publicly displayed, and when Reason TV interviewed him, he was explicit that he agrees with at least some of what all of them have to say. So I thought this would be an interesting opportunity. Now, he talked about a number of topics, some of which were interesting from a libertarian perspective, others less so. And then the other interesting thing was simply to gauge the audience, where they are. It was an interesting venue. He spoke in a place that was a church that was actually built out of demolished barns. Several barns were turned down, so it was a sanctuary, high ceiling, altar, pews, balcony, but it was all made out of this really rough-hewn timber. The place has since become a charter school. Interesting history, I suppose. He talked for 1 hour. Justin Amash is not actually the congressman of my district, but the district immediately adjoining my district to the south. Only about a 25-minute drive to get to where he's the congressman. And he was basically he made 2 town hall meetings. The kind of format of he just spoke very briefly for maybe 10 minutes on what his main issues are right now, which were the NSA, and actually forget what the other one, I mean, other than he says he believes in civil liberties, and then he just let the audience speak. Now, the composition of the audience, I'd say there were about 40 people there, with mostly aged, older people. There may be 3 or 4 people who looked like they were about my age, and then there were 2 gentlemen who had their sons there, so their sons were quite a bit younger. But other than that, we're looking at a 50 plus, 60 plus, 70 plus crowd. Probably the average age was probably in the upper 60s, I'd say. So ironically, that's double the age of Amash himself, who is 33, I believe. So a couple interesting things that he had to say, interesting perspectives. As can often be expected in a case like this, some people came out and basically started giving expositions about conspiracy theories. Very Alex Jones-esque type things about Agenda 21, assassinations, blah blah blah, and I always find that very uncomfortable, because you really get the sense of somebody watched something, they're really enthralled by it. There isn't necessarily that much evidence, but they're just they are committed totally to this idea, and they just can't help but spout it. And as much as that makes me uncomfortable, it also, I think, it's good for people to speak out. And I was kind of curious to see how Amash would react to this. My guess, I haven't been to any of his other public events, is that he gets a lot of this. And even if he doesn't get it in public, I know it's being posted on his Facebook repeatedly. He is, by the way, well known for posting every vote that he votes on, which is all of them apparently, on his Facebook, and why he votes the way that he does, which is unprecedented. He actually gives explanations to why he votes, and it's open to comments, and people comment, and he does read them. He receives more input than it's likely he can actually go over, but his reaction to these speeches when they happened was, I don't know if this or that is true, but at this point I am willing to believe just about anything is possible, that people should speak out, whatever it is they do or do not believe. and that he wasn't prepared to dismiss any accusation. Another interesting thing, he spoke about how jaded he has become since he was in Congress. He said, after this man had spoken, about all these conspiracy theories, he said, "Look, um, before I even went to Congress, I had a very, very skeptical, cynical view of government, the federal government in particular, and that, I had heard all kinds of stories, and on my arrival, I would just say that he believes that the worst things that you hear are the minimal depredations that are occurring. That things are much, much worse. That there is a the situation is far worse than we know. In regards to any number of topics, he basically said the worst abuses are not reported. They're not reported to anybody. And then someone actually asked about the media. It was funny. He started for a minute to say the media generally, and then he paused and said the national media, looking around to make sure that there weren't any local affiliates, local newspaper or whatever present. Didn't want to step on their toes. And what he said, I think, was accurate, that at the national level, the clique in Washington and New York, the high-ranking people in the major networks, the high-ranking reporters, they are basically in the same ship as the power elite, the people who are running the government, and they identify with them more so than they do the rest of us. They're on the same ship, so to speak, and so they are not an unbiased opinion. He says, of course, there's the occasional good reporter, but of course people in the audience reported, yeah, and then they get murdered, or at least that's the speculation in regards to the Rolling Stone reporter who died. I can't remember his name. He talked a lot about the NSA, which apparently is his big issue right now. He says categorically that they are recording all phone calls, including the actual audio of them, of all Americans at all times. This is something that they have progressively admitted to, going from it's not happening to denying it to they're keeping records of some people to all people to they're just keeping records of the calls that you make, but not the actual audio, and to now the audio. Of course, he considers this all to be a violation of the Fourth Amendment. He claims that members of Congress, by and large, are now against this because they are getting feedback from their constituents. He says when he goes to confidential or classified briefings and asks questions, he is almost always told that his questions are themselves classified and that he can't be told, even though these are classified briefings. He's a lawyer, as are most people in Congress. I think some important things about him. His family is independently wealthy. They're millionaires. They're self-made millionaires too. His father was forcibly evicted from his home in Palestine by the Zionist Israeli state, and eventually fled to the United States with basically nothing. And by the time he had children, 10, 15 years later, he was very wealthy. And they are independently wealthy, not ridiculously, billionaire or anything like that, but wealthy enough that he doesn't really need. I believe him with the stipulation of all politicians that he's really doing this because he's interested in the principle. And so the higher, and this is kind of interesting, you do a public choice analysis of people's incentives, and you say, well, politicians are incentivized to take as much graft as possible, to skim as much money as possible. But that's only assuming that money is the thing that they value most. If they value other things more, then they're likely to do that instead. And I think in his case, in the case of someone like Ron Paul, this is actually what's going on. Is they value other things higher than money. Now, actually, I don't think most politicians are actually after money so much as they value power or influence or fame. Fame is pretty venal, but I don't think it's quite as evil as the lust to rule over others. Which I have to believe Tolkien was talking about when he was describing Sauron in the Ring, the will to dominate all life. seems to be a high priority for at least the higher echelons of government. And of course, a lot of lower ranking people that just don't have the sophistication to rise that high. I've met a lot of low ranking people who want to rule over as many people as they can. They're just too ineffectual to get much higher than, say, the beat cop, or the social service director, or a public school principal or something. Um, uh, but then he correctly said he believes, and I think this is probably the case, that the main purpose of the NSA spying is not to spy on Americans per se, but to have a way to blackmail politicians and all other wealthy people. His example would be the NSA would come to him and say, hypothetically, he wasn't asserting that this had happened, hey, look at all this dirt we have on you. Oh, by the way, our funding bill is coming up. So how are you going to vote on that? This is kind of interesting. I know others had mentioned this before, and it strikes me as that it's a possible transition of the stage. And I'm not one to say that there's necessarily a natural progression of stages in the state, but a transition to something where one element of the bureaucracy, for whatever reason, comes to technically and physically dominate the rest of the state apparatus. So kind of like the Janissaries or the Grand Vizier taking over the Ottoman Empire, or the eunuchs taking over the Chinese imperial system at some points, or the Praetorian Guard in Rome becoming the kingmakers that are the de facto bureaucracy running things, and the emperors simply becoming titular masks on top of some bureaucracy. I don't think the U.S. state has been that way really so far, because for most of its history, the bureaucracy that it wielded was relatively minor compared to the rest of the society. Um, when bureaucracies take over like that, it usually takes time for them to develop infrastructure, elan, personnel, procedural techniques of manipulation. Like if let's say if the Civil War, had happened, and the Army of the Potomac and the Grand Army of the Republic had not been disbanded, but kept as large as they were during the war from that point on, my guess is we would have switched to a military dictatorship a long time ago. But as it happened, the army was disbanded, as it was again after World War I. And so there wasn't really much of a chance for those bureaucratic institutions to develop to the extent necessary to um, take over the rest of the state. However, since World War II, and I don't just mean militarily, there was never really any demobilization, not in terms, I mean, there were some, but not compared to previous instances, and not just of the military, but all manner of bureaucracy. Of course, that actually precedes World War II just a little bit into the New Deal, and in some instances back to the Progressive Era, to the Wilson and Roosevelt. Um, we're getting to the point now where some of these institutions have been established for a long time and have had a lot of time to develop, and they're getting to the point where some of them have enough of an apparatus that it's conceivable that they could start to become the de facto ruling government, and then the elected politicians. And I'm not one to say that having elected politicians is any kind of guarantee. I'm not saying this in terms of, oh, the state's getting worse now. This is just a change that I'm seeing, or potentially seeing. I've heard other people say, and this is what Amash was saying, look, the NSA is not going to give two shits about me or you or people without any influence. But if they're rich, or they're powerful, if they're in the media, if they're in Congress, they have the apparatus now to blackmail them, assuming they're not squeaky clean. Which I think there's a high probability Justin Amash is squeaky clean, relatively speaking. I mean, who knows what kind of debaucheries he's broadcast over the internet over the years. I certainly don't. But that was his assertion of that's probably what the NSA is really turning into, which I think is an interesting observation, something to look, I don't know, not forward to, but look for. There were quite a few questions about immigration. This is where, and I'd say the tenor of the audience was surprisingly radical. I mean, the idea that Washington is corrupt and venal and evil and tyrannical was a widely held belief among the audience. Antagonism toward the federal government was very, very high, but not entirely consistent. And there's points here where severe irrationality still shines through. And this is most evident when the issue of immigration reform was brought up. Basically, many people in the audience were upset with the idea that there might be quote-unquote amnesty. Now, obviously, as a libertarian, I'm not that worked up about this issue. Eventually many of the people in the audience started to say to quote-unquote secure the borders. And probably the best thing I ever heard Stefan Molyneux say, and everyone here knows I'm not the biggest Stefan Molyneux fan. He did a whole video about immigration. It's probably a 45-minute video, and I don't remember any of it until the very end, when he just looked in the camera and he said, fences can also keep people in. And I think that is the clinching argument for me on this. Whatever other wishy-washy, oh, Mexicans aren't very libertarian and they're going to vote for socialism and blah, 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 blah. And I've heard it all. Look, when I was in college, all my friends were the biggest Tom Tancredo, Jim Gilchrist, Minutemen, um, you know, ostensibly minarchists, but totally anti-immigration, radicals. But that argument right there, that's the worst argument, and that to me that just ends the issue. But so many people here, it was interesting. Amash started to say, and this is kind of not very interesting in a libertarian perspective, but just his, if people are curious, his thoughts on where this debate is going to go politically, which is kind of intriguing in its own kind of macabre way. That the Democrats want to basically they want amnesty and they want a citizenship for everybody because they'll vote Democratic. The Republicans are opposed to that, probably simply for that reason. Probably for the simple reason they don't want there to be millions of new Democratic voters. So what he thinks they'll negotiate on is they will make legal immigration easier, which he thought was a good idea. Both his parents are immigrants. And, from a libertarian perspective, that's fine, although he did not really go into many details. He said the next compromise will be what to do with all the people who are already here. And he thinks that what the Republicans will probably insist on is that they never become citizens, but then they also will never be deported, and that they will simply be granted some sort of legal status. Own property, can work, blah, 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 but can't vote, which is fine with me. Now, here's where some of the irrationality of the audience started to come through. One woman who appeared, she was older, but I would characterize her as a Russian mail-order bride because her husband was there and he was from Michigan, and she could hardly speak, and she started, oh, but I did it legally. Legal immigrant here is going to relate to this because he used to hold this exact same view, I think. I came here legally, and it's not fair that I went through all this and they didn't. This is kind of like I got hazed, so you should get hazed. It's not really an argument. It's a psychological defense mechanism to justify what happened to you by forcing other people to do it. But then one woman was, Amash said, well, look, there's 11 million of these people. What are we going to do with them? And one woman was just like, deport them all. And I actually blurted out, that's impossible. I'm reminded of when Abraham Lincoln, one of the issues that Abraham Lincoln was really passionate about was deporting all the black people in the United States to Africa. This is one of his issues that all from when he was just a junior politician all the way to his last month, they have documentation. And as actually the war was wrapping up, he went to Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, and he said, I want you to look into what the logistical requirements would be to deport all of the black people from America. All the niggers is what he would have said. And Gideon Welles said, I'll need some time, and he went and looked in it, and he came back like a month later, 2 months later, and he said basically all the resources of the government, if not the entire society combined, could not deport half of the annual increase in the black population. Basically, it's impossible. Now, beyond that, the only way you could even attempt to deport all the Mexicans, I mean, you could say it's a different situation now, and that's true. We wouldn't have to necessarily deport the Mexicans to Africa, but also there's a lot more of them, and technology has altered the dynamic in some way. But the only way you could even attempt to do it would be with an unbelievably draconian police state, which is so the people who are advocating this, they're all worried about tyranny, they're worried about the government, they're worried about government abuse, but then they're advocating for this horrible police state, which either means, probably means they just haven't thought about their position enough to realize that's what it would imply. Because you can't just write them all letters and say, please leave, because they've already, violated the law, so to speak, so why care? That's a clear case of irrationality coming blatantly through, and a contradiction in terms. You have these people who don't trust the government explicitly. I mean, they're saying we don't trust the government, and we think that they're evil, and where's our line in the sand? This is one of those meetings that's kind of verging on the edge of violent revolution, sort of. It's permeating, and if you do afterwards in the side conversations, everybody is thinking in those terms. Not that they're about to or anything, just that this is where we seriously need to be discussing at this point. And yet they're going to advocate for that, which I thought was ridiculous. And Amash, to his credit, said that's impossible. Also, there's no way it can happen. Going door to door, police, no, that's not a solution here. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The next thing, also kind of a political thing, maybe not that interesting from a libertarian perspective, is the discussion of entitlements. Because there were a couple people there who asked, what about my Social Security, pointing out that their cost of living is not keeping up, and that they're becoming progressively more impoverished. And he said, look, the big, he didn't call them Ponzi schemes, but the big social welfare programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which together with the military are the largest share of federal budget. If we don't change them really soon, will not have any chance of even continuing to pay people who are currently receiving benefits. So if you're already on Social Security, if there isn't reform, you're going to see a reduction in your benefits, either in absolute or nominal terms. If we reform it now, depending on how austere the reforms are, there is the possibility that they could perpetuate, for some time in the future. However, but if those reforms aren't enacted, and he wasn't specific, but basically if they allow the future liabilities to be reduced by allowing people to opt out, by increasing taxes, that sort of thing, it would be possible. He was saying, he said, that's only if we address it very soon. If we don't, they will become completely untenable. And my guess, with the kick the can down the road kind of mentality that's incentivized in Washington, that I can't remember which order, but I think it's more likely that they will simply not do the reforms, and that as a result, these systems are going to crash and burn, and anybody who is depending on them will literally be fucked. And I think that's what's in store. I actually think that in terms of Social Security, people my age are in better shape, because this is, I highly doubt it's going to make it to when I would be in that position. It's going to happen before then, I think. That's as close as I'm ever going to get to a prediction. And by the time I'm too geriatric to take care of myself, assuming that's still an issue in 30 years. And I'm not saying that because I'm predicting the singularity by then, only that the progress is so fast at this point that it's very difficult to make such long-term predictions, without acknowledging all kinds of wacky possibilities. He also talked about Obamacare. People asked about that. I asked about that. And I'd heard this also relatively recently. There are two minds in the Republican Party. The Republican Party right now has the ability to defund Obamacare. Even though they don't have Obama and they don't have the Senate, because they have the House, they could defund Obamacare right now. Obamacare can be killed by the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. And they know that. But it's not happening. Why? Because many of them think that Obamacare will be a dismal failure, and it will be. And so they want to let it be a failure. And I can kind of understand that, except by Obamacare failing, that will mean probably many thousands of people, and I mean many thousands, tens of thousands of people, will probably die as a result. And the other part of that dynamic is they're not doing that because they're opposed to socialism generally and they hate government and they want there to be a free market. They're doing that because of the partisan political gains they think that they can reap by bloodying the nose of the flagship social welfare program of the Democrats for the last 20 years. So, yes, thousands of people will suffer and die so the Republicans can make political points, is essentially what that means to me. Now, it's not like, I mean, the Obamacare itself is the Democrats doing the exact same thing. They're trying to vote by selling us a snake oil that's going to kill people. That's what socialized healthcare always ends up being. Um, so I'd heard this before, but he's saying just the conversations in the House, that's what they're talking about. They have the power because all financial, all revenue-based legislation must originate in the House. They could defund Obamacare, and they're not doing it because of that reason. Another thing people kind of talked about was Benghazi. Now, Amash was way out front in opposing our involvement in Libya at all, and to me, that's still the primary argument. Why? And so, why talk about subsequent controversies when the main controversy is the fact that we were quote unquote there in the first place? And I, to be perfectly honest, have not been paying tons of attention to Benghazi because it always struck me as just the Republicans trying to bloody the nose of the Democrats. And while I fucking hate the Democrats, I can't get too riled up out of bed when it's just the political parties, fighting each other with, our lives and wealth and whatever. But people just kept asking about it. And he said, I would have thought that Benghazi would have been a bigger deal. And he said there were a lot of Republicans who are actually trying to use it as a club against the administration, and they're not making any headway because he believes, this is Amash's belief, that there are high-ranking Republicans who are culpable as well, and that's why it's not going anywhere. I think this almost certainly would include John Boehner, although he didn't say that. He thinks that there's something being covered up because the investigation is basically, they're saying, don't look here, there's nothing to see, which is sure indication that there is something to see that they don't want to be seen, and that the only reason it's not moving forward is because there's bipartisan support for that not happening. And so he thinks that there are Republicans. One person who comes to mind, I would just have a hard time not believing John McCain wouldn't be involved in something like that. He seems to have a penchant for sticking his old revolting face in Middle Eastern states that he wants to have intervention in. But, Amash didn't say that. That would just be my supposition. But I thought that was interesting. So, let's see. Did I talk about everything else? I talked about the incentives of the legislature. Why do they abrogate so much power to the president? They don't want to have votes because then they can be criticized one way or the other. And so they like to just have the president decide anything, like go to war in Libya, for instance. And if anything goes wrong, they can say they weren't in favor of it. And if anything goes right, they can say they always were in favor, and there's no vote to kind of hold them to that. Another interesting perspective that he gave is he is very cognizant of the fact that there is an enormous double standard, and that the agents of the government and himself, but even others above him, um, are above the law and that the rest of us are not. And he was explicit. Look, if anyone here did the things that are happening in Washington, you would be arrested and charged with perjury or homicide or bribery or any number of other crimes, high crimes, and punished severely. And the people in the administration, and he didn't just, and not just the, and he was always very careful to say, look, everything bad that can be said about Obama has antecedents in Bush, and there's lots of other bad things that go with Bush that aren't necessarily attached to Obama. But he said, look, the law, they don't get prosecuted, they don't get in any trouble, and they're completely like Teflon. Like they can go on TV and do these things. And he was specifically referencing the head of the NSA lying in a deposition to the Senate. So that's perjury. And then, like the next day, he said, "Oh yeah, I was mistaken. I didn't know what I was saying." And if any of the rest, if any of you had done that, you would have gone to jail immediately. So it is refreshing to see, there isn't this pretense of, oh, there's the law and we're all equal under the law. He knows that that's not true, and he's telling his constituents that it's not true. Um, He didn't strike me as a sycophant. When people said things he didn't agree with, he wouldn't agree. He wouldn't agree with the immigration people. There's also some talk of campaign finance reform, which he said, look, when the government reforms campaign finances, it's to benefit incumbents. That's the whole point. That's what they're trying to do. That's what they're doing. He's aware of regulatory capture. He brought up the point that regulations have their genesis in corporations who use them to compete and destroy their smaller competitors. That was an unsolicited remark on his part, basically relating to a question about Obamacare. So I think he's an interesting guy. I don't think that we should place, undue hope. He kept saying, you guys can influence your congressman if you just call them. And everyone's like, well, look, you're our congressman. You're an okay congressman. What about all the other shitheads up there? The evil motherfuckers who are they're destroying all of our lives so they can be the center of a cocktail party's attention. And that's the ones who are only after fame. The ones who are after bloodlust and power, well, that's an even worse story. I mean, it's frustrating where, he's saying, call your congressman. Like, you are a fucking congressman. You're probably the one. There's maybe a couple others now that are closer. Not, I don't think they're the gold standard, but maybe they're, silver, copper, or something. But um, that part was frustrating. I think that engaging in politics is horribly inefficient use of your time. I have given him money in the past. I gave Paul money, and I've given him money, and should he ever run, I'll give him more. Just because I like that he's out there saying these kinds of things. He is advancing what Scott Horton kind of calls the libertarian bridge, or the great compromise of, which is tell the Democrats, we'll cut down the military if you cut down the social welfare programs, which is kind of the opposite of the actual compromise. The actual bipartisanship that this country has had since at least World War II is, or the Great Society, I guess you could argue, is, instead of saying should we have guns or butter, it's let's just have both. Let's have all the welfare and all the warfare, and that's the compromise. Now the kind of libertarian one is, well, let's compromise by cutting them both down. I don't have high hopes of that happening, but that's the kind of rhetoric I like to see, and that's what he's talking about. So, you know, is it perfect from an anarchist point of view? Absolutely not. It's interesting because, we live in changing times, and this is a person who's right at a nexus, where he's, all these ideas we can talk about, I'm very positive he's familiar with, because they're getting blasted on his Facebook wall all the time. And for him to have the principles and positions that he does, he would have been exposed to an awful lot of this literature. I mean, he can't have a Rothbard portrait on his wall and not know what ANCAP is. And that's not to say he explicitly is one, or that I agree with everything he says, but I like having that in the debate. So anyway, any questions or comments, let me know, and I'll talk to you all later.